Despite the fact that water covers 71% of the Earth, there is still so much we don't know about the ocean floor. Mapping geological features at the bottom of the ocean isn't just something worth doing for curiosity's sake. It's important to a variety of players, from companies looking to install offshore wind farms to the Navy. Today's founder is working to solve that problem. You're listening to Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. And today we're talking to Joe Wolfel, the CEO and co-founder of Terradepth, the company that is working toward increasing ocean knowledge through autonomous, high-resolution, scalable data collection in the deep ocean. I'm your host, Becca Skutak, and Dom isn't joining us again this week, but never fear, I'm here with TechCrunch climate reporter Tim Deschamps. Tim, how's it going?
Pretty good, Becca. Thanks for having me here.
Always a pleasure. And Tim, why don't you start by telling us today's two truths and a lie?
Yes, here they are. So, number one, we have mapped 50% of the ocean. All right, number two, Joe and his co-founder were both Navy SEALs. And the last one, funding for the startup was difficult before the rise of American dynamism within the venture capital world.
Ooh, listeners, you'll have to keep listening to figure that one out. But before we dive into the conversation with Joe, a quick reminder to rate and review the show. You can do so wherever you are already listening to this episode, so super quick and easy for you, but we really appreciate it on our end. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Joe. Hey Joe, how's it going?
Awesome. How y'all doing?
Hanging in there. Can't complain. Before we dive in too deep, pun fully intended, I gotta know, we're gonna talk about your company Terradepth, and I know it's related to the ocean. You got the idea while you were in the Navy, which is also, of course, related to water. What got you interested in the oceans, water, the Navy, all of that stuff to begin with?
Sure. I grew up in Chicago. Though you've got Lake Michigan, there's not a large ocean there. And so, honestly, I was looking for something different. And every time we went to the ocean, I just felt a little bit more whole. And luckily, we had the opportunity to go to the ocean a lot. My father was an airplane mechanic. And that was back when you could actually fly standby because there wasn't mileage plus and things like that back in the day. So we got out there a lot, and it just was a place that I felt like I needed to get into. So the first thing I do when we landed was just basically run into the water in a lot of cases, which freaked my parents out a little bit, but it worked out.
I love that. Yeah, I wanted to ask because my grandfather was actually in the Navy, and he's from Iowa, and he joined the Navy when he had never seen the ocean before. So I was curious, like knowing where you were from and stuff, kind of like what the story was there. Why don't we talk a little bit about Terradepth, and then maybe we'll take it a step back from there.
Yeah, sure. So Terradepth's whole aim, our mission, our vision, everything we're about is to fundamentally improve the way humanity makes decisions with respect to what we do and don't do in the ocean. Mostly because the ocean's a hugely opaque space, but it's a massive part of our planet, and we just don't know a lot about it. When you don't know a lot about things, you tend to make suboptimal decisions or don't make them at all. So we're out to help that.
And how did you get the idea for this company to begin with?
That actually came from the Navy. In the SEAL teams, which is what I was, you learn pretty quickly and pretty violently that the ocean is a large, unforgiving, and unknown place. You know, that really stuck with me and my co-founder, who was also in the SEAL teams with me. And as we went through our Navy careers, we did a lot in the ocean, but I mean, not as much as you would expect just based on the timeline that we were in. But, you know, the fact that humanity knows very little about the ocean always stuck with us. So when we left the Navy and actually had an opportunity to start our own businesses, mostly technically focused in our case, it just became a mission. And really it ended up becoming a continuation of the service that we both really missed from being in the Navy as well. And luckily we had the opportunity to start a company to really make a big impact on better, faster decision making.
Now, Joe, how exactly did you get this idea to map the bottom of the ocean? I'm curious. Like, it's not the first thing maybe that pops into a lot of people's heads when they want to understand the ocean.
Yeah. So back in 2005, actually, so my co-founder, Judd Kaufman, and I, we were about ready to go to Baghdad at the time. 2005, we actually had a U.S. Navy submarine run into an underwater mountain. And at the time, Judd, me, and the guys were learning how to use this new thing called Google Earth to navigate on land. And it was this crazy thing that you could use. And they were like, holy cow, look, you can see the bottom of the ocean. And then we hear the news that this submarine runs into an underwater mountain at flank speed. We're like, oh my God, well, I can see the bottom of the ocean on Google Earth. So we've obviously got good maps. And that's when we learned that actually most of that data is extrapolated from wave height. So a lot of what you see on maps is a prediction because we just don't have a lot of high resolution information about the seabed in general. That really stuck with us. And so as we, again, transitioned out of the Navy and started working with tech companies, we got really involved on the data side of the house. We were working with a company called Seagate Technologies. They make about half the world's data storage. And as we got involved in essentially the value chain around data delivery, we got very interested in where there were big gaping holes in data sets. And from a geospatial perspective, there's a huge gaping hole in the ocean space. And so there were just a lot of things that came together. So as we had discussions with Seagate leadership, we talked about the opportunities and how we could fundamentally impact human understanding and the value of that and where we could go with it. Luckily, Seagate decided to fund us back in 2018 to get started on tackling the problem.
Wow. Now, hold on. I want to rewind just a little bit. So the stuff that you see on Google Earth in the ocean is actually just predictions based on wave height. So we're talking about stuff that's thousands of feet under the surface of the ocean, and they're looking at just like literally the surface to try to predict that.
That's right. Essentially the big problem here is, we're getting very, very high resolution imagery of Earth's landmass on a daily, hourly basis. You can get on your phone, and a good friend of mine runs a company called Skyfi. You can call down, you can task satellites at this point from your cell phone. And, Luke's got a great business doing that. But the problem is, you're really only going to get terrestrial data, and you're only really able to penetrate about 10 meters of ocean with respect to electro-optical energy, right? It's just this huge bandwidth signal attenuating medium. And so to get really high resolution data that you make a decision off of or really drive understanding, you've actually got to be in the ocean to get that data. And it's just very expensive. It's very risky to collect. And, we've got a huge ocean data collection problem in general, and that impacts the rest of that value chain. So to your question, in a lot of cases, what we do is we essentially say, hey, look, the ocean's behaving like this from the surface, and we can get that in a very scalable way from satellites. So there must be something of gravitational importance under there. And so then we stick it on the map, or we don't stick it on the map. And that's when you run into stuff.
Seems kind of wild. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Depending on who you talk to, everybody likes to throw out, we know more about Mars than we do about the Earth because of the ocean. And that's true, just based on, again, signal attenuation. We figure we've probably mapped about 10 to 20% of the ocean to a quote unquote meaningful degree of resolution. But even then, in a lot of cases, to make a good decision about like, hey, is there something down on the seafloor? Could we put something down on the seafloor? You need very high resolution in the sub-meter category, which in a lot of cases, you need to be down near the seafloor to get that information, which drives the need for robotics.
I was going to say that 10-20%, is that around a meter, sub-meter resolution?
No, not at all.
Even worse?
Yeah, oh yeah. I'd say 100, 1,000.
Oh, wow. And so in context, just so people understand, the stuff that they see on Google Earth, Google Maps, et cetera, that tends to be probably like about a foot in resolution?
Way more than that.
So
way less resolved than that. You're talking about massive features like the Marianas Trench, things like that. Sail Drone is an autonomous surface vehicle company that does ocean data collection from the surface. They just found hundreds of unidentified seamounts off the coast of California, I think last year.
Wow. And I'm curious because this is an area that there definitely are people who have tried to kind of map out the ocean floor before, or sort of tried to tackle the fact that we just don't know very much about what goes on down there. Was this your first idea, what you guys are doing now, or how did you guys formulate an actual idea to start to try to tackle this with Terradepth?
Yeah, it actually was. So what I sketched out on literally a bar napkin in 2018 is what we're doing now. So we had this conversation with Seagate. It was this broad conversation around consolidating this data delivery chain for ocean geospatial data. And the CEO at the time said, interesting. So basically, you're talking about mapping the ocean at scale, making that data easily accessible, and then finding a way to create this, essentially, I called it an ocean information engine, in which you go from data collection to data consumption, and you really create this market around an economic logic to incentivize further collections such that we can explore. He said, well, how would you do that? And I was like, I have no idea. So Judd and I went off on our own. We did about 9 months of market validation. We knew that ocean data was valuable to international governments, international militaries, because that was our background. We had no idea what conservation or commercial interactions in this sphere looked like. And so we went out and got smart on that. And basically we came back and said, look, what this problem demands is somebody taking a big bite.
Right.
And that big bite is going to have to look at the problem from a holistic perspective. And we're going to have to be vertically integrated. And by vertically integrated, I mean, we're going to have to invest heavily on the hardware and robotics side so that we can massively scale ocean data collection capability. And I can get into why that demands technical and hardware and robotic resources. But then we've also got to radically improve the user experience with that data, because right now, I mean, people go out and collect ocean data, you put it on a hard disk drive and you mail it across the world, and somebody puts it into the computer, accesses it, processes it. I mean, it's totally crazy. And so we said, look, we're going to have to impact everything from the robotic means by which this data is collected to make it scalable. We're going to have to deal with the operational aspects of that, because being in the ocean is hard and dangerous. And we're going to have to deal with the data and software architectures that make that data easily accessed. So, we came back and essentially I mapped out how all these things could interact and be essentially synthesized into a workable business. And that's the strategy we came up with. And that's what we're still out doing today. So, I mean, really very little's changed from a strategic standpoint. Obviously, the tactics changed depending on, I mean, this was before COVID.
Right.
So things had to change through COVID, right? We survived all that, ups and downs in the market, differences in investors, things like that. But the strategy is largely the same.
And where are you guys at in this process? Do you guys have robots already on the ocean floor? Are you targeting a specific area to start? Where are you guys at in this journey?
So we do three things right now that impact the problem set. So the first thing is we created this software architecture called Absolute Ocean. Absolute Ocean makes it really easy for a non-subject matter expert to take existing data holdings or ocean data that's being collected right now, upload it into a cloud-native system, and make it really easy to upload, download, visualize, share, or keep private that data. And so we sell that as a SaaS subscription, and we sell that commercially to government entities, again, just who need to make good, fast decisions. And the real magic of Absolute Ocean is it enables a whole new level of interaction between interested stakeholders, as opposed to this very siloed hard disk drive mailing back and forth desktop experience. Well, that's all well and good, but you're not really changing the world if you're just dealing with existing ocean data holdings, and you're not changing the way that essentially pipeline of data is flowing into the architecture. It's powerful, but you can do better. The other thing we do is we launch commercially available assets to do ocean data collection now. Now that's quote unquote cutting edge because we're using autonomous robotic assets. The problem is current assets still require babysitting.
Yeah.
Humans who are sitting on top of those robotic assets in a boat. And these boats are big, they're expensive, you're out in the ocean, a lot of human exposure risk, right? But we do that because there's a demand now. And we do that for offshore wind, submarine telecommunication companies. Like, most people don't know that there's 1.3 million tons of unexploded ordnance in the North Sea right now. And so if you're going to put an offshore wind turbine in the North Sea, you probably want to know that there's a 750 kilogram bomb from World War II sitting down where you're going to put that piling.
I'd imagine so, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a big problem. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of unexploded munitions in the English Channel, for example. It's a big problem. So we do surveys like that to enable offshore wind installations, to make sure that oil and gas pipelines are sound, that they're not breaking, that they're not leaking, that they're not at risk of creating an environmental problem. And we take that data, we put it in an Absolute Ocean, and it's this nice streamlined experience for everybody. So that's great. But the problem is that, again, we're still babysitting the robots. So really the crux of the company from a hardware innovation standpoint was, how do we minimize the requirement for babysitting of the assets? And so to do that, we said, well, obviously, and this is SEAL math, like, well, you got to be able to do what the ship's doing with robots.
Right.
So we said, okay, well, what's the ship doing that maybe a robot could do? And that turned into the first patent of the company. And so basically we said, look, the ship's doing three things. One, it's providing an energy recharge capability, because you're pulling the robot up out of the water, you're putting fresh batteries in, you're putting it back in the water. Second thing that ship is doing is people are pulling data, interpreting the data, retesting the robot, putting it back in the water. And the third thing that nobody thinks about is that ship, because it's sitting on the surface of the ocean, has a GPS fix. And it is taking its GPS fix and saying, well, here I am on the planet. And then it sends an acoustic ping, because remember, satellite energy doesn't penetrate water, right? You don't have GPS when you're diving, which is why SEALs get lost all the time. Don't tell anybody that. We're never lost. But you send this acoustic ping to the submerged asset. And so the robot says, okay, well, if you're here and you've got a GPS fix based on the angle and distance of that acoustic sound ping, here's where I must be. And so you correct your inertial navigation system across time. Because it doesn't matter if you find a bomb from World War II underwater and you get a cool, sexy picture of it, if you're off by 250 meters.
Right.
The ocean's a big place and it's dark, right? So basically what we did was set out to replicate those three functionalities purely robotically. And so we basically created the world's only cheap self-recharging drone that has enough onboard data processing and it can work in teams. So essentially they're self-supporting to replicate the functionality that crude surface vessel provides right now. So where we are on that, we just went through ocean trials in March. So everything went really well. We're doing another design review on that, and then we're going to be back in the ocean here in about 60 days to do further testing and trials.
I'm always curious because when we talk to deep tech companies, you get the whole range of people who are like, we're working toward this moonshot, we're doing it every day, but like, we're not going to launch for 5 to 7 years. Like, we've had many companies come on the show who are like, we're just not launching for a long time. The tech's just not there. And it's so interesting to talk to you and be like, well, we have these 3 different areas and like, we have products in market now as we're testing these other things that are going to come down the line. And I just think that's so interesting. And were you guys intentional about setting up the business that way to make sure you kind of were out there getting customers right away? Or did it kind of just lean naturally in the direction that you guys were going?
No, it was intentional. The one thing you learn pretty quickly in combat is you can't steer something that's not moving. And there's no substitute for on the ground learning, right? So we're eating our own dog food every day. So because we're out on the ocean, because we're collecting ocean data, we're putting it into our own data platform. And so, there's been a bunch of times where we're like, that sucks. That doesn't work.
Right.
And then we change it on the software side and vice versa, right? It's like, hey, can we be more efficient, getting ocean data from the ocean up into the cloud? And it turns out that, yes, we can. In one instance, we took an ocean data delivery process that was taking about 4 weeks, and we did it in 3 hours based on the way that we combine virtual machines, based on the way that we're using, I think I can say Starlink because it's pretty ubiquitous now, but the way that we're using different communication media to really get that data up and do in situ processing in conjunction with the cloud architecture that we've created. And all those things too, from just getting your butt kicked out on the ocean perspective and these robots breaking all the time, it reinforces everything that we do from an engineering perspective on the hardware design, from a reliability perspective, from an endurance perspective, from a requirements perspective.
So you mentioned dogfooding, Joe. Are you guys at the point right now where you're using your own platform to do mission planning when the submersibles are out on the ocean?
Yep. So we actually are using Absolute Ocean to go do that now. We're not releasing that yet because it's not where it needs to be, but absolutely, that's going to be a part of it.
And I'm so curious with this type of a company, what has it been like fundraising for this company?
Tough sledding. It's been difficult, right? And as I'm sure you guys have seen, you say hardware to venture capital and people just go running for the hills.
Right.
Now, they might want to talk to you because they're interested in that, but it's pretty tough to get people who have been conditioned in this software's eating the world piece to be willing to take the risk on hardware-enabled plays these days.
For sure.
And it's a big sector, right? I mean, this is not a sector in which people's friends are investing. The customer and finance bases traditionally in the maritime world are defense and oil and gas. And traditionally, these have been, essentially incubated companies, or spin outs from defense primes and things like that. We are one of a very, very few companies who are essentially venture funded to attack the maritime space.
And I did want to ask how the venture landscape has changed over the last few years. I know even I haven't been covering venture for that long in the grand scheme of things. And I know when I got started, companies that could, in theory, like sell to government were just like, no one wanted to touch those companies at all. And now it seems like people are at least talking about being really interested in things that could, in theory, have commercial uses, but also help the government, the military, things like that. And I'm curious if you guys have felt those effects when you've either gone out to fundraise or just with people sort of interacting or reaching out to the company, or if it seems like people are saying that, but maybe they're really focused in a different kind of area when they say that.
Yeah, it's hit and miss. For sure. I think to your point, the narrative is definitely turning around. But That's one thing that I never actually understood. So, for example, when we were raising money in 2020, 2021, exactly. The question I got from venture capitalists was like, all right, well, how many of these robots are you going to sell? 5. It's like, well, first, we're not selling robots, we're selling data. So we kind of got through that. And then to your point, recently, gov tech and defense tech is having a moment. Mechanically in the industry, nothing's changed. I mean, my point to venture in 2021 was always there's this fascination with recurring revenue, which I'm all about, and everybody should be about that. And if you look at recurring revenue, government programs of record are 5 years. So it's 5 years of recurring revenue. Now, you might not like the fact that that's a 5-year project, but it's still recurring revenue across time. From a narrative perspective, yes, things are changing. From an uptake perspective, I think it's still hit and miss.
Yeah, that makes sense.
More from this conversation right after a quick break.
Yeah, did you find at all that having a software platform at the outset, as opposed to robots first, get the data, and then put it on the platform, did that change the story at all with any investors? Or was it still just a lot of that hesitancy until you found the one that clicked?
Yeah, there was a lot of hesitancy around that because, again, one of the first questions you're going to get with a software platform is, what's the size of your market? And how many data holdings do you have? Things like that. And so you've got this chicken and the egg issue. I mean, you can create a nice business, and people have them around ocean data processing. There's companies out there doing a great job, and we're partnered with a lot of them. It's just that market's going to grow somewhat slowly across time, and that's not a venture type investment. For better or worse, the way that I always postured it was that this is going to require vertical integration. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy around that from a venture capital perspective. One, it's very difficult to do, and you've got to do a good job. 2, you've got to have faith that I can handle the type of friction and complexity from a leadership perspective to make those trades and manage the different types of humans that are going to be required to get all of those things done. And there's just not that many people who can do that.
And you just touched on it a little bit, so I was going to ask you this. What was it like transitioning from being in the Navy? And I know you and your co-founder both worked in the tech space between then and founding this company now. But did you ever think you would be an entrepreneur? Sort of like, what is the journey like of going from being in that field for so long, and now it's like you're starting a company that, of course, is related based on experience, but it obviously must be pretty different.
It is. So first, I never thought I would be an entrepreneur specifically. So when I was in the SEAL teams, that's all I thought about. I didn't think about anything else. It really just never came up. And furthermore, I guess I just didn't think it was fair to the guys, right? I mean, it's all I did. So I didn't think about a life after that. I was just focused on that. And, when I decided to get married and things started changing and the war was kind of slowing down, it's like, okay, well, what are we going to do? It was, okay, well, let's see what this whole business thing is about. And I think specifically special operations lends itself to entrepreneurial endeavors a little bit more maybe than general purpose forces, just because in a lot of cases, you're working in small groups and you're put into a very ambiguous situation with certain right and left limits. Obviously, you're still in the military, but a lot of it's, hey, go figure that out. And that's what entrepreneurial folks do.
Yeah.
You're selected for that from just a human perspective and military special operations selection and assessment, but then it's really also nurtured in those communities as well. So in my specific case, I was super fortunate to get on with a group called the McChrystal Group. It was led by a general that I used to work for, Stan McChrystal. And it was the perfect transition job because the entire company was formed around what lessons learned are applicable from military special operations combat to the commercial world to enable operational effectiveness and efficiency, and which ones aren't. So for 3 years, I had the opportunity to sit back and think really deeply about what I kept and what I left. I mean, it was definitely easier for me than some folks because I was just fortunate in having that network. And I mean, the people there were just incredible. Still difficult, but doable.
So of those things that you kept, which would you put on the top of your list? Maybe 1 or 2 things that's really helped you in this journey as an entrepreneur.
And decision-making and risk adjudication. Those are the top 2. How do you make decisions in risk and ambiguity? And then how do you adjudicate risk and ambiguity such that you can move quickly? Those are the 2 most, I guess, operationally important things. I mean, and then the constant would just be the importance of humans. Just what is the distinction between leadership and management, and where are you putting your time and focus? Trying to balance, leadership is about inspiration, and management in a lot of cases is about control. And how are you balancing those again to operate with the right amount of risk? So you're being responsible to your shareholders, but you're also executing. What I tell the team always is, I'm like, look, guys, we got to be humble enough to learn, but arrogant enough to execute. Right. And that's a fine line, but that's what it takes.
I'll bet. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting to think about. And you touched on this a bit too already, but to dive a little bit deeper, how does this all translate into how you guys hire? Because I know you mentioned a little bit too, it's like there's so many different parts to this business that would in theory require people with like very different backgrounds. So it's like, how do you think about hiring and making sure everyone comes together for that like cohesive mission of the company?
Yeah. So I think you just nailed it, right? How do you create cohesion while avoiding groupthink? That's the holy grail.
Yeah.
And the way that at least I've approached that, and this is directly informed by the teams, I try to mix domain expertise with domain ignorance, and then I count on good leadership to manage the inherent friction that's created. So you're trying to create innovation through outside ideas, and that's that ignorance. Right? I'm not saying like an ignorant person, but I'm just saying like you're probably coming in from outside the maritime tech industry, which is super cloistered, I guess would be the English word for that, right? I mean, it's so tight, right? And that's okay in some instances, but you also want some fresh thought and ideas coming in. So, I mean, that's the biggest piece, I would say, from an overarching perspective. From an actual hiring perspective, behavioral interview questions, things like that. We try to get a really good sense of who the person is, vice what do they know. We're always looking for learning agility and team ability over, do you have an MS in computer science on your resume? Like, I frankly don't care. And he's amazing. He's one of our best developers. He's got a master's in chemistry. I think he'd taken like Code Academy or something, and he's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So hire for trades, train for skills broadly. Obviously, the stuff we do is dangerous, so we hire for subject matter expertise in ocean operations and things like that. So we're doing it safely, but again, look for a good mix.
Yeah. And something else I wanted to ask about is, I know because you guys already, of course, have customers for some of these different strategies that you guys are doing, but like, what is demand like for this now? Does demand grow in the future? Like, walk me through kind of like what that part of the business looks like.
Yeah, so there's demand right now. It's just the customer base has been essentially conditioned to believe they need to wait 12 months, 18 months. Hey, we're going to do 6 months of survey, and it's going to take you 6 months to get your data. The customer base has been conditioned for that. So in a lot of cases, that's in a lot of the project planning. So there is the category creation piece here and a disruption piece where we're like, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to wait that long. Oh, and by the way, maybe if you increase, essentially for us, it's the TAM, but if you increase the stakeholder base and get multiple diverse perspectives looking at this data, we can actually do things differently. For example, you've got a lot of hydrographic surveyors go collect the data, they process the data, they finish the data, and all the end user's seeing is this finished product. But what if you could get that end user involved earlier in the process? Now there's risk there because like maybe you didn't collect it the right way. Maybe you do need to go back out there. But I think there's a trust exercise here that if we can get through, then I think we're going to be able to do something really special again in just improving human decision-making in the maritime space, right? Like one thing again that we saw in combat was when you're looking at in our case, it was highly social problems. War and what happens, and there's second, third, fourth order effects, and ambiguity, in which like ambiguity is something that you're never going to be able to reduce no matter how many resources you put against it. Uncertainty is something you can reduce, and those two things to me constitute risk. But we've got a highly ambiguous, complex situation. Really, the only way to start picking away at that problem is to get multiple diverse perspectives looking at the same data set, such that you understand the problem so well that solutions almost become intuitive. And that can't happen in the ocean space when data and information is so siloed and sparse, and there's just such a lack of access to it. So, long answer to your question, but right now, demand's there to create a great business, and everything's fine. It's going to be fine. It's going to grow. We'll be successful. Changing the world, though, is going to entail broadening that, and that's going to essentially have to happen through a mindset shift, but also through the creation of economic logic, right? Like people have tried to do this before from a nonprofit perspective, and just the incentives aren't aligned, frankly, which sucks to say, but I do think it's the truth. So it's going to be around creating economic incentives around data transfer and sharing that's going to really drive this and break it open.
So, Joe, earlier on, this is a question still on the customer side of things. You mentioned that a lot of the existing customers are in defense, they're in government, and that some of the other ones are still emerging. Where are you seeing some interest from some of these not defense, not government customers?
So there's a whole commercial industry, right? So the other way to say is like, who cares about the ocean and the ocean floor? So we have focused to date on what's called high resolution geophysical data. And that is basically a characterization of the seafloor. So that would be an acoustic image. It would be a point cloud, the bathymetry, i.e. the topology of the ocean floor, magnetic signatures, in a lot of cases for that unexploded ordnance, ferrous materials, chemical, temperature, depth, sub-bottom profiling, what's that sediment look like to make a good initial decision on, could you put something down there like an offshore wind turbine? Right, so that's where we focused. And so on the commercial side, again, that is offshore wind. So offshore renewables, ocean-derived energy, that is existing asset operators. So some of the listeners out there may know what TSOs are, transmission systems operators. So these are high voltage DC cables that electrify nations, for example, oil and gas pipelines that are pre-existing. We've got, I think, 40,000 miles of pipeline in the Gulf of Mexico alone. But we don't really know because some of it got put down there and didn't get mapped, and some of it got put down there and most of it gets left when it gets decommissioned. So, it's folks like that who are the traditional commercial customers. But as you kind of move up into the water column, which is something that our technical solution enables, because basically if you talk about teaming robots and I've got one on the surface and I've got one underwater, eventually I have to go leapfrogging up and down. So now we can start characterizing the volume of water. So now who cares about that? Aquaculture, environmental DNA, climate. So if we can characterize deep water ocean currents, then we can understand climate change better. Just like if we characterize the seafloor, we can understand climate change better and understand climate patterns, weather patterns, things like that. So there's just a whole mess of folks that, again, if you can start collecting data cheaper, and you can start proliferating it, candidly, in a lot of cases, I don't know who's going to be able to use this data because they're going to be smarter than me and have a problem that needs solving as long as they've got access to the data. But, I would say broadly, more of the climate, more of the conservation folks, more of the aquaculture folks would be kind of on the outer edges of an expansion in the markets.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I've seen how geographic data terrestrially has completely transformed those fields, those industries. And it seems like there's a great opportunity to do that here to really kind of open things up for other players to come in and figure out what to do with this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, the terrestrial satellite imagery market is a great analog. I would say maritime's about 20 years behind space. So if you look at all the companies that have popped up from a data analytics perspective, just because they had access, like crop yields and methane emissions and all the things that come out of just having a good data collection network, and the sky's the limit. And it doesn't need to be us, right? I mean, we're trying to create the platform that enables all that good stuff to happen.
I think we just have time for one last question, but I wanted to ask you, because this is a space that you've mentioned throughout, people have sort of tried to tackle this problem in the past, and for various reasons, people haven't been able to find success. As you mentioned, this does touch so many things. It feels like it's such a huge potential problem to solve. Does that ever weigh on you? How do you keep motivated when it is such this huge project? People have had these stumbling blocks. How do you guys keep yourself motivated? How do you sort of reduce that burden on yourself?
Yeah, well, a common thread throughout my life is I'm just too dumb to quit in a lot of cases. So it's generally not a problem. No, what keeps me motivated is the team, right? We've got a really special team. We invest heavily in the team, and just that's what's always going to carry the day. I mean, just for me personally, just being around people that are driven to fix a hard problem and who keep showing up, right? So it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy when you've got a team like that. As far as weighing on me from a confidence perspective, are we going to get this done? The last few years have really bolstered my confidence there because we've just made so many good steps in the right direction. There was a period in time where my confidence, my lack of confidence, was really centered around the fact that I thought I was missing something. Because my experience is that it's the strategic assumption that you make that is either wrong or it's an assumption that you didn't know you were making that's going to kill you. And for me, it was, I refused to believe that there wasn't a system out there that was really changing the game with respect to how ocean data was being interpreted, disseminated, kept, made searchable, retrievable. And I just refused to believe it. I was like, this is just too straightforward. I'm missing something. And it took me a few years, but I finally got behind the fact that no, we'd actually created something that is game changing. From the risk to Terradepth is really a capital risk piece at this point, right? Will we be able to raise enough money to attain the vision or not? And are we acquired and it takes us a different direction and we can't attain the vision based on that different direction, which to your question has been what I've seen happen in the past, right? Somebody makes a good advancement and boom, acquired. And then that technology either gets killed or diverted and folks don't attain the vision that they set out to attain.
Well, a somber note to wrap on, but hopefully that is not what happens to you guys. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Joe. This has been super interesting. So appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate it. This has been great. It's good talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
And that was our conversation with Joe. But before we dive into the outro, Tim, what was the lie?
The lie, Becca, was the fact that we've mapped 50% of the ocean, when in truth, we've only mapped about a quarter.
Which is kind of crazy.
It is crazy.
I feel like every time I learn more about what's going on in the ocean, or like even with today's conversation with Joe, I'm like, wow, I guess every time I'm reminded we know less than I thought, and it somehow keeps getting like we know less and less
and less. Yeah, I know. Well, that's the danger with knowledge, right? Once you have it, you realize how much you don't have.
Right.
And I think the ocean is a great example of that.
Yeah. Just going off of we know so little about this type of stuff, like hearing about some of the issues like they had in the Navy with submarines and just not knowing there's a huge mountain underwater. Like, sure, do we know every critter that lives on like the deepest parts of the ocean floor? No, I assumed we didn't know that. But like a huge mountain, like we haven't mapped stuff like that is like very interesting.
Well, and especially you'd think the Navy of all people would know, and that maybe they'd have some classified information that the rest of us don't have. But I think that really does illustrate really actually how little we know about the space.
No, I mean, no better example of how big of a problem this is than if like the Navy can't.
A sub colliding.
Yeah, like great. Wow, that really is a big problem worth solving. One of the things that stood out to me was just the fact that they've been so intentional about building the company. He mentioned like they have a couple different areas that they're working on, but how even as a deep tech company, they made sure that they had a product they could sell right away, which is so interesting because I feel like, and I know you probably come across this in the climate space often, but like a lot of companies just don't think about it like that.
No, they don't. Or if they do, it tends to be related to kind of the hardware problem that they're working on. So maybe they'll do some engineering or advising services on the side with an eventual customer, hopeful customer, or something like that. But it's not really the same thing as what Joe's doing, because what Joe's doing is actually integral to their full business model, right? It's not just like a Band-Aid to get you through low revenue years to take to investors to say, hey, we've got some revenue on the books, et cetera, et cetera. This is actually kind of like building a key piece of the company and getting revenue from it, which is probably really hard to do, right? Because he's doing both software and hardware at the same time, kind of focusing on not necessarily two different customer bases, but really kind of like two different operational paradigms.
Yeah, for sure. Because you're totally right that even the companies who do this, what they're working on now is like, well, this will transform into Y at the end of the day. And Joe is like, no, this is something like we kind of imagine we're always going to run as part of the business, which makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. In the long run, probably the software part is the thing that's going to make them the money, right? The access to the data and the platform and stuff like that. And the hardware is what enables it. It's interesting that you're kind of seeing that not necessarily then also play out in the sequence of revenue.
Yeah. What else did you think was interesting?
I thought it was interesting, his perspective on how the Navy made him ready to be a leader. I mean, you hear this all the time from veterans and from the armed forces themselves about like how enlisting can, prepare you for leadership, et cetera, et cetera. But I really did get a sense from him that he had a well thought out and interesting perspective on what leadership means and the difference, I thought, in particular, between leadership and management, which I thought was particularly germane and interesting for founders.
For sure. Yeah, I agree, because it's really just the way he said it was something that had not occurred to me, that like there is such a huge difference between leadership and management. But he's totally right. We can think of a lot of great leaders who probably weren't very good at management.
Yeah.
Thinking of people in power, like I've always said in our space, just the nature of journalism, it's like you have an editor and some of your editors are also managers, but some of them aren't. some editors are good at editing and managing, some are better at managing and not editing, some are good at both. Like, it makes sense to kind of draw those like granule nuances because it's so right. There are probably so many startups where they have great leadership and that could even be the downfall if it's not good management.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the important thing maybe for founders is to recognize whether you have both of those qualities within yourself or whether you need to find that co-founder that can complement, right? Are you a leader? Are you a manager? Can you do both, or do you need to kind of separate those roles within the organization?
No, I think this is like the definition of the like executive chairman role, where it's like founders step back. They don't want to manage. They don't want to do the CEO duties, but they want to have that like leadership quality, that sort of say and like what the quote unquote the fun stuff of the business, the product. And but yeah. And what he was saying about how the Navy prepared him to do that seems right, because like his line about being like, you have to be smart enough to know what you're doing, but you have to be like arrogant enough to believe in yourself to go do it. And that's really, I think, something that founders don't talk about often enough. But every episode we talk to someone who said, my idea is so good that it can not only make me a living, but it's going to grow this ginormous company. And they're confident on that fact. And of course, companies succeed all the time. So people aren't wrong to have that sort of a stance to begin with. But you kind of do need to really believe in yourself in a way that I probably couldn't about myself. Let's be real.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the way he says arrogance there too, right? Like, I don't think it's necessarily a derogatory statement in this case, but I think it's like saying that, yeah, you have to be a little bit kind of like crazy and boastful to think that you, of all people, are going to be the one to pull it off.
Exactly. Yeah, the way he talked about so much stuff, like, was so humble and like well-spoken on these different areas. Like, I thought the American dynamism piece we talked about was interesting because I'm not surprised that when these guys got founded, they weren't having super good luck with fundraising and things like that, because that just wasn't as much of a thing. VCs weren't touching areas like this as much back then. But I thought it was really refreshing that he was like, oh yeah, it's brought up interest, but it hasn't necessarily turned into dollars yet, because I have a feeling like we'd have other startups on who are like, oh, the AI wave, like it's been crazy, like blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you haven't raised around a couple years. So like, has it actually helped you? Like, let's be honest.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you see that in a lot of industries where it's early and untested. And until there are some successful exits or major valuation bumps or later stage rounds or something, I think it is going to kind of continue to be challenging to attract dollars from VCs, particularly more generalist VCs who wouldn't necessarily specialize in stuff like this.
No, so I'm definitely interested to hear about how the company kind of grows from here, because they're at such an interesting point in the journey, and with all these changing conversations about this area and sort of building companies that can help these government entities and beyond. Yeah, I'm just curious like what the next 5 years would look like and how it would have looked differently if this sort of rise in interest hadn't happened.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think a lot's going to depend on how the government reacts in this case, right? If they're eager to sign some contracts and also how much they can attract private sector customers. I mean, there's a lot out there, right? If you think about existing people that are looking to map or exploit the oceans in some way, there's definitely ample opportunity.
Yeah, especially like private energy companies, I feel like is going to be a huge area just with offshore wind in general, let alone whatever sort of like climate initiatives we'll have going in 10 years we don't even know about yet. But originally thinking about it, I was like, oh, mapping the ocean floor. I was like, for the government.
Yeah.
And then talking to him, I was like, wow, actually, a lot of people would want to know what's at the bottom of the ocean, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I can see government making up a sizable chunk of their business, but I don't know it's necessarily going to be the majority.
Interesting space regardless.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Skutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori-Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.